we've gone over what a Bible is. It's a collection of the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. And so now we ask, well, how did we get to this books? With all the other books out there, again, what if one was lost? You know, what if we didn't get the right ones? What if after 2,000 years, something was changed and adjusted? And that's a lot of questions, so slow your roll for a second, you know what I'm saying? But first, we need to ask the question, how did we get these 66 books? Kind of covered it a little bit, but I want to go into a little bit more detail. And first, we have to start way back in the ancient world. In fact, in the ancient world, to see that there's a series of writings about the Creator that have gone through a process of development. Now, this has no problem for Christians. It may freak you out for a minute to think that, whoa, the Bible went through a process of development. Yeah, because it wasn't just sat down and written by one person. It's through dozens of authors over 1,500 plus years, and it just grew. And so it begins way back. If you think about it, the first, it was likely there were just oral stories about Abraham and Adam and Eve and Noah and the flood and this Tower of Babel and the stories of Abraham's children. These would have been passed on as stories, possibly written down, possibly we understood that they were in some kind of written way, but most likely they were sharing it in an oral sense, telling a story and hearing it. Now, that's weird to us today, where many of us are into reading, or maybe you're just into watching video. You can remember the last movie you saw, or you can remember a bit of what you read last time. But man, when you're sitting in class in college or in high school or wherever you've had to sit in a seminar, at your business meeting or whatever, you can feel like I don't remember anything that was said to me. And if you're not an oral person who can hear and understand, an auditory learner, that's the word I'm looking for, then oftentimes we can feel like, hey, nobody can learn this way. Yet the ancient world was pre-literate. There's not even a printing press yet. And they learned things through the spoken word. They would memorize it. They would gather it in. They would understand it. I've been in other countries where it was still oral. And man, they can pick up information through their auditory gate like nobody's business. It is incredible. And so it's not unlike the reality that they had these stories. They passed them along family to family, tribe to tribe. Eventually, however, we know that at least it indicates in the Pentateuch that Moses wrote down the laws. As he went out and he led the people of Israel out of Egypt, as they engaged in the various events with God, and God showed up, he was writing things down. In fact, it says in Exodus 34:27, for example, and the Lord said to Moses, write these words, for in accordance with these words, I've made a covenant with you and all Israel. And when Moses had finished writing the words of this law in a book, to the very ends, and that book means a scroll, they don't have books yet, but he was writing it down. Then Moses commanded the Levites, take this book of the law, put it aside next to the covenant of the Lord. And so there's this picture that, hey, we have this law, we have this thing, I've written it down. Now, I don't think this is that crazy. Moses was raised in Egypt in Pharaoh's household. He probably knew how to read. He probably knew how to write. These were slaves. They had to engage in the discourse and the marketplace. They probably had ways of writing things down. And we found certain things like Proto-Hebrew and things like that are out there that seem to indicate that this may actually have happened earlier. And so that's a debated issue, but ultimately, it says Moses wrote it down. I don't think it's a hard stretch to think a highly educated guy in a hugely important place like Egypt, the top scholarly world at the time, wouldn't know how to write. And so as we look at this, the majority of the books in the Hebrew scriptures, though, in this here, the Tanakh, this is a Hebrew version. Again, it reads actually fun is right to left. And as you read this, you see that the readings are consistently claimed that the prophets wrote them down. The prophets wrote it down, or one of their associates wrote it down. And so oftentimes it didn't make it into this book if it wasn't associated to a prophet. And as God brought his prophets, as God acted, these people wrote these things down. And slowly the Torah began to grow to add in the prophets. And then eventually there are writings like from Solomon and various kings and wisdom information and new information as more people are coming and looking over these things and pulling this information together to keep it in one clear, documented place so they wouldn't forget their history and what God had done. So, some books, like Proverbs, were collected after what we call the Exile. If you don't know the history of Israel and what went on there, they had their land, they had conquered it, they had this kingdom. It was 600-700 years. It was now around, actually it was 536 around there, that Babylon, this big empire, marched in, took them over, and completely wiped them out, guiding their people off into exile. Now, they came back surviving because they kept focused on what they're teaching. Now, that seems to indicate that during this time period, they had begun to really, really pull together their writings and knew what was going on. Other writings were pulled in and put alongside that they knew were of Scripture, and so they wind up having this collection. Now, there's some debate over which books were included. The Apocrypha we talked about last time were in the Greek writings of the Septuagint. And the Septuagint was a Greek translation. It was the first translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into the Greek language. And they say it was done by 72 scholars. And so the word Septuagint means 70, and the legend that these 70 came out and they had this document that was the Septuagint, based on old manuscripts. And so they may have debated over which books belong, but the Hebrew-speaking people seem to only include the 42 books we have today. And so the writers of the time seemed to indicate there was a three-part structure. In fact, if you look back in those time periods, they talked about the Torah, they talked about the prophets, they talked about the writings. This seemed to exist already. The Tanakh was set somewhere in the 300s BC. That's before Christ. You're going negative back there. That's well over 2,300 plus years from us. Now, Jesus also, in his reference, and those around him, referenced the law, the prophets, and the writings. In fact, Josephus, who writes at the end of the 100s, also calls them the law, the prophet, and the writings. So it's likely that these were settled. And again, at 300 BC, a long, long time ago. And so there's not a lot of question over kind of, hey man, do we really have the right books in the Old Testament? I really think we can say we did. But there's a bigger debate over, do we really have the right books in the New Testament? And so when Christian scriptures came about, they began with the teachings of Jesus. We need to start with Jesus. He was an itinerant preacher. It means he roamed around preaching his message of the kingdom of God. And as he preached, he gathered disciples. Now that doesn't seem like a big word to us. That's like a follower of Jesus, right? No, a disciple is a student of a rabbi, a student of a teacher. The job of a rabbi was to ensure that his disciples, these students, knew what he said, lived out what he said, and were just like him. In the same way, the students were to know what he said and live it out. They were constantly concentrating on what Jesus taught. They were constantly concentrating on how Jesus acted. Man, they were taking in everything like a sponge because they wanted to be like their rabbi. Now, we need to understand that. Because when we get into the New Testament writings, especially the stories of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, we are talking about genius. I mean, these stories, to this day, the Good Samaritan, the idea of the talents, all these things have been used over and over and over as a representation of how we should live morally and how to live a life well. Jesus' stories are so magnetic and so clear, they keep going on. And so here's the thing. We have these 4 units called the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have been known for centuries early, all the way in the early 100s, 110. They're already talking about these early 4 messages of Jesus as they reference the true teachings of Jesus. And I think Jesus must have passed it on really well because that's what he was. He was a rabbi and he did this job. Or we got to say that these 4 guys were just 4 geniuses that invented a genius named Jesus somehow. And I just think that stretches credulity. What we have is one genius who trained and taught multiples that we see his teachings go on. And so really, I don't think we need to worry that we're not reading Jesus' real words. While they began as oral things that they told in Aramaic to one another, they would eventually be translated into Greek. In fact, there is the church historian Eusebius. He actually attests that the original Greek scriptures, these what we mean by these Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels, they actually began with Matthew. Matthew first wrote down the statements of Jesus in Aramaic. And then Mark, he's not an apostle, but what he did is he was hearing the preaching of Peter. He was helping Peter. And so people urged him, get this down, get this down. So he wrote down the teachings of Peter. Now at that point, Luke would eventually come along. He would research what had been written, and he would compilate all this information because he was asked by a Roman official who this Jesus is, what he taught, and I want to know more about it, and I want to know more about church history. And so he wrote 2 volumes. We call it Luke and the Book of Acts. These 2 volumes become clearly the teachings of Jesus, and they are researched with eyewitnesses. We get stories from Mary because he had time to meet her and talk with her. We get stories about the inner group that like the Sanhedrin, because he had time to meet those Christians and hear their stories. We get some amazing stuff in Luke that's not found in Mark and Matthew. Yet people point out those three are together. They seem to say the same things, and so it's very likely there was interplay as the oral stories were going, as they were writing this down. Maybe they're translating Matthew out of Aramaic, and it starts to line up. A lot of the language is similar, a lot of the things they say are very similar, and it appears they used Mark as the base. And why not? Peter was the lead apostle. And so it's not surprising that we would try to pull our text in together. And so it's not collusion, it's just they were telling what happened from the 3 different perspectives. Then along comes John. The Gospel of John is actually written by the Apostle John, the close friend of Jesus, the one who was taught by Jesus, and he writes down what he believed had been left out from the other Gospels. He fills it in late in life, probably just before 70 AD. Some people push it back to after 70 AD to 90, but there's a lot of implications. These were written in the first 30 years after Jesus had died and rose from the dead. And the reason why is there's no mention of the most epic, most dramatic moment in all Jewish history, which is in 70 AD, the destruction of the Jewish temple and the Jewish war. It's absent from within the Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. They just kind of go on as if it's always been there. In fact, Luke clearly indicates that this is kind of how things were going, and he ends with Paul being arrested in Rome, which means if he's using Mark and he may be using Matthew, that dates that before 70 AD. That's in the 60s. And so we have clearly some evidence that these are the eyewitness documents of those who knew Jesus, walked with Jesus from the apostles themselves. Now, these 4 Gospels become well known. They become the authoritative documents along with the writings that we get from Paul. Now, Paul was another apostle. He was a missionary, and he wrote all kinds of letters to the churches. And those letters began to be collected. And they are known by at least the middle of the 100s. And they are talked about as Paul's letters. They're understood, and they were used in churches, and they talked about it and spoke about them. In fact, the other letters had the same kind of things. And so this process had begun. But notice, they can't collude. They are stuck in persecution. The church for the first 300 plus years cannot come out of hiding, or Rome would smack them, or some other authority would come out and destroy them. And the persecution kept them from gathering together to have an opportunity to connect and decide, hey, this is what's going on. And yet still, when they emerge from the darkness, out of the catacombs, and are able to talk, what they come down to is basically this list of 27 books. Fascinating that this happens. Now, the early church basically understood these were all connected. And we don't know quite what happened, but a lot of people claim that it's like there was this self kind of revelation that people were changed by the books. They understood it. It may be that a prophet filled with the Spirit of God stood up and said, this is the Word of God, and it happened in multiple churches, so that these became things they would read during times. That's my idea, but that may have happened but the bottom line is it rang true of Jesus' teachings. And they knew these were from the apostles. And so they took this as authoritative. They began to read it like they read the Hebrew Scriptures. They began to reference it like the Hebrew Scriptures. In fact, the church fathers who would come in the next 100 years would quote all these 27 books over and over and over and over in order to make their case about how to live the Christian life. Now, let me just say, all this didn't happen in a council. This happened organically, and it came about because of a problem they had with a Martian. Not that kind of Martian, but Martian. He was a shipbuilder's son, And he was interested in the idea that Jesus had broken from the old ways. That was, the law was over, and he liked this stuff that Paul had written about. So he began to only take Paul's letters and edit them. And then he took Luke and he edited it, and he took this and said, this is what we really need to live by. And he was a Gnostic, and he hated the Old Testament. He disliked Jews, was anti-Semitic to the max. And yet still, the church came along and said, no, we got to have our own list. And so lists start appearing, trying to say, this guy's wrong. This is not what we use in churches. And slowly the list of 27 books came about after many, many years. And so the church ultimately comes to discover that this is the 27 books that we use. Now, there are a couple that were debated, like 2 Peter and the 2nd and 3rd John. Some people argued about Jude. And look, but the vast majority of them were received completely including Revelation and in 1 John and the 4 Gospels. There was no debating that these belonged. And so they just kept on with these pieces. Eventually, the church fathers themselves would gather together after the persecution lifted, and yes, they would begin to talk it out. And they would say in their writings, they would say to each other, look, these Gnostic books, we know when they showed up, they're fan fiction, we don't want those in here. These are the books. Look, these other ones, they're cool, but they don't line up with the teachings of Jesus. They're clearly the teachings of men. Let's not include those. And so they didn't end up in the collection. So what we end up with is this collection of the text. And what the churches agreed to basically came to be officialized in the 500s. 500 years, 470 years later, it was officialized by finally a council. Although we had the lists as early as the late 100s, it takes that long for the persecutions to climb down and the church to gather together and begin to put this together. And we don't need to worry about, we don't need to add or subtract anything from the Bibles that you and I are using. And so those Bibles have come to us as a collection of both the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. Eventually they'd be translated into Latin. Those Latin ones would go around Europe as the gospel would spread there. Eventually it would take many people's lives to translate it into English and German. And so then it would be published and spread around. But you and I, we have this Bible today, and we have an opportunity to read it, knowing that we've got the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, the ones that the church has always been reading, the ones that the Hebrews have been looking at and reading since 300 BC. This is the known Bible of the time. But wait. How do you know it's the real Bible? I mean, hasn't it been changed? I mean, hasn't it been edited and broken down over the last 2,000 years? Come on. How close to the original Bible is this really? And that's what we'll get into next.